I'd like to welcome you to this forum. This is jointly sponsored by the library and the Friends of the Bethel Library. And today is a presentation by the winner of a Library Research Award, which I'll say just a bit more about in just a minute. One other upcoming event that the Friends of the Bethel Library are putting on is our Spring Forum, which is Sunday night at 6:30, same location. It's on social networking. I think the official title is Calling Card to Calling Plan, Social Networking Then and Now. We're going to have three faculty who will do some presentations. Diana Magnuson will do a brief presentation on how it used to be done. Calling cards. You dropped off and you received calling cards. So she'll talk about that a little bit. As we get into the modern age, Nathan Gossett will talk about some of the more popular, the origins of some of the things like Facebook and MySpace. Talk about the intended or the stereotypical target audiences of some of those social networking sites. And then Peggy Kendall will be the main speaker talking about some of the ways that we interact in good and bad ways with this new set of media. But today is a presentation by Taylor Furta, who is the winner of our first year's Library Research Award, which is an award of $250 sponsored by the Friends of the Library for a student who has done a research project that made significant use of library resources. In order to win the prize, you have to submit your paper, submit an application which includes an essay talking about how the library was used in good ways to do the research, and one of the perks is to be able to present your work. And so I would like to first of all present Taylor with the $250 prize. Congratulations. And I think I'll give you as much time as possible, so why don't you come up and present your research.
Can I have, I'm going to need my paper back. There's actually a bunch of them. Perfect. I wish I had.
So that's yours, this one. Okay.
Well, I guess I'd like to start. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Thanks for coming. Appreciate everyone here to support me when I present this. I realize there's probably a lot of other things you could be doing during this chapel hour that doesn't involve an undergraduate pontificating about a dead theologian of the 8th century, reflecting on Viking texts. So thank you for coming. I guess I'd like to begin by thanking Faculty Development and Friends of Bethel for sponsoring this scholarship. I think it's a special thing for me, but also for Bethel University. I think it's always a good thing when scholarships kind of, I guess, promote undergraduate scholarships, so I thank them. Also, I want to thank the librarians for all that they do here at the library. I know that I've worked extensively with a few of them, and they're just amazingly brilliant people. And it's funny when you go over to that desk, within 5 minutes of you telling them your topic and wanting some help on research, they are probably more interested than you are about your own topic. So they're just fascinating, just bright people, and it's been so much fun to get to know them over the last 4 years. Also, just a thank you to a few professors. Professor Kevin Craig is the professor that I wrote this paper for in his medieval Europe class that I took last fall. Professor Craig is an amazing individual. He's an amazing professor. He's taught me almost everything I know about ancient history, about medieval history. And I think more importantly, if you know Dr. Craig, you know that he kind of is an expert in almost everything. He knows some of the most minute, insignificant facts, it would seem. So that's always fun. But more importantly, I think Professor Craig has taught me how to be a lifelong learner. He's very interested in the students. He's interested in what they're doing, the questions they're asking. So I really appreciate his help. Also, Professor Chris Gertz, he's been my advisor for 4 years now. Professor Gertz has spent countless hours listening to me, probably whine about scheduling difficulties and a host of other things. And he's just an excellent learner. He cares for his students. As a student and also as a Christian, I think that he's been very influential in my own life. And then also Professor Guystra, she recommended the scholarship for me. to actually pursue, and if it wasn't for her help, I probably wouldn't be here today. By virtue of this paper also being historical but also theological, I have a few theology professors I'd like to thank. Professor Paul Eddy. I've been a TA for Paul for 2 years now. He's been such an amazing person in my life, not only as a student but also as a Christian. He's a great role model, and he's just been an amazing influence in my life. His professor his colleague Jim Bilby also spent a lot of lunchtime with him, listening to him talk, and helped me through a bunch of different things. I guess dealing with theology. I'm also Professor Christian Collins-Wynn. I'm taking a historical theology class with him right now. I think he's taught me a lot about how theology doesn't necessarily occur in a vacuum. It's always kind of birthed in a context, whether that's historical or cultural or political. And I think we would do well to understand that context. And then also Professor Mark Reasoner. I took Latin from Professor Reasoner 2 years ago. And he's been more than willing to open his office doors to me and help me do some translation, pronunciation, which I'll be doing a little bit in this presentation. And I just thank him for that as well. So I guess why I've decided on this topic, I think someone who's interested in history, but also in a personal sense, I'm very interested, I guess, in how the church deals with violence, how the church deals with questions of peace, deals with questions of just war. And being somebody who's interested in history, it's natural that I would like to study past Christians who have come before me, who have tried to deal with the same questions, but in a different context. I've read, I guess, elementary readings of Bonhoeffer, Yoder, and Hauerwas, and that's kind of, I guess, instigated kind of this interest in my own life. So I guess trying to understand someone who's come before me and how they dealt with violence is kind of what lays the foundation for this paper. So I guess what I'll do here is I'm going to read the scholarship essay that I wrote for this scholarship, and reflecting on the Bethel University library and its role in my research and in my own life, and then hopefully give a quick historical context of the time period that I'm talking about, who is Alcuin, what Viking attacks occurred, and then present as much of the paper as I can without running out of time, and hopefully sneaking out of here, answering a few questions without getting burnt too badly by someone. So I guess I'll begin by reading this, my entry scholarship, or my entry essay. Submitting a research project to the Bethel University Library Scholarship challenges one to reflect not only on the research process itself, but also on the distinct vocation of the Christian historian and how the community of faith uniquely shapes his or her task. In this essay, I will reflect on the importance of the incarnation for the historian's vocation and the study of history in general. I will then suggest that this incarnational conviction makes intelligible Bethel's commitment to be truth seekers and is an undertaking that is cultivated and sustained by the community. And finally, I will illustrate how the Bethel University Library and the community that shapes its mission has equipped me with the resources needed to research and write this scholarship essay. Central to the story of Christian theology is its understanding of truth. Different from the Platonic forms, truth for the Christian is the decisive act in which God invaded the course of human history and became flesh and made his dwelling among us. It is this miracle of Emmanuel, God with us, that provides the basis for any Christian understanding of truth. The belief that truth is not an abstract ideal, but the presence of Christ himself radically alters the historian's calling. We study history primarily because the Lord of history has promised to meet us there. And in history we find that God, through the presence of Christ's church, has not abandoned the world. In this respect, the historian's task is as much theological as it is historical. Understood through the reality of the incarnation, the Christian understanding of history is grounded in a conviction that all of human history is God's history, and to study it is to commune with God. If we allow the incarnation to shape how we approach the past, we understand that the study of history is not the mere knowledge of past events, but rather the worshipful exercise that teaches us about the nature of truth revealed in Jesus Christ. The practice of truth-seeking for the historian, therefore, is twofold. Studying history in light of God's presence within history, and living in a Christian community that understands learning as worship. In this sense, the library is the fulfillment of Bethel's commitment to be truth seekers through the process of transforming students into a community of disciples who commune with God by utilizing the mind that God has given them. Thus, when understood as a holistic vocation involving both mind and heart, studying the past is not reserved only for a 4-year academic program, but is rather a commitment to lifelong learning. The Bethel University Library instills this commitment by challenging students to seek truth wholeheartedly, and in the process of communing with God, be transformed into a community of people empowered to speak truthfully to one another. Therefore, since we do seek truth together, the task of the historian cannot be severed from its connection with the Christian community. Without the guidance of numerous librarians and their persistent efforts to track down the sources I needed, my research would have been largely short-sighted and my essay incomplete. In conjunction with these librarians' efforts, both the ClickNet and Iliad databases contributed to the researching process by locating and transporting sources from a consortium of other libraries. As a historian, as a person searching for arguments put forth by leading experts in the field of medieval theology, JSTOR and RefWorks provided the means by which academic articles were found and organized, allowing for an unhindered transition to the writing process. These examples provide a concrete illustration of what I spoke of before. My research was made possible and guided by a community of fellow truth seekers. On the whole, therefore, the community of Bethel University Library has helped me develop the crucial researching skills needed to excel in my undergraduate coursework, as well as prepare me for possible graduate level academics. But more importantly, and in a much more holistic sense, this community has taught me how to view the study of history as a Christian undertaking, emphasizing the reality of God's presence throughout history and challenging me to worship that God through the gifts that I've been given. So that's kind of my reflections on the Bethel University Library, its role for students here, its role for Bethel University, and I guess in some sense a lot more than simply a database of information that I guess translates into an intellectual sense for students. I think it's something that's a holistic venture. So I guess now I'm going to provide a quick historical context of my paper and then hopefully present as much of it as I can. Alcuin of York was an historian, cleric, poet, educator, and writer. Born in the same year as the famous Battle of Tours in 732, Alcuin would later become the chief educator in Charlemagne's palace court in Aachen from 781 to 796. Here his duties included educating the royal children, writing literary, theological, and poetic works, and advising the king on important ecclesiastical decisions. He died in 804, just 4 years after the coronation of Charlemagne by Pope Leo III on Christmas Eve Mass. He is regarded as one of the most important architects of the Carolingian Renaissance, as well as a dominant intellectual figure in the early Middle Ages. During Alcuin's life, the Carolingian dynasty, headed by the Frankish king Charlemagne, would come to unite much of Western Europe into a single dominion that historians now call the Carolingian Empire. This period was preceded by the Merovingian dynasty, which all but ended with Pepin of Arostal's victory at the Battle of Tetri in 687. His son, Charles Martel, divided the kingdom at his death among two sons, Carloman and Pepin the Short. In 751, Pope Zacharias I declared Pepin the legal king of the Franks, thus beginning the Carolingian dynasty. Pepin's son, Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, would come to build the Franco-Papal alliance between the Frankish kingdom and the Catholic Church. He focused his attention on expanding the empire and building the prominence of the church. So that's the historical context of that. Now looking at the Viking raids. In 793, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is a written collection of historical events in Anglo-Saxon history, recorded that, quote, the ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter, quote. In response to this attack by Norwegian Vikings, Alcuin wrote a series of 6 letters, 3 to King Ethelred of Northumbria, 2 to Bishop Higbold, and 1 to Cudred, the prince of Lindisfarne, or the priest of Lindisfarne, excuse me. He also wrote to the monks of the twin monasteries of Wearmouth and Jarrow, which, only a year after the Lindisfarne raid, would also be attacked by Viking raiders. Both of these monastic communities were located on the eastern coast of Britain in a territory that was called Northumbria. The reasons for raids on these specific monasteries are quite obvious: their geographic proximity to the Viking seafaring routes, their relatively unprotected premises, and the treasure that was most likely within them. So hopefully that provides some type of historical context for you. I'm now going to dive into my paper and see how far I can get into it without, I guess I've cut some of it, but we'll see how far I can get into it. Throughout the long history of the Church's struggle to take seriously the biblical precepts for peacemaking, the changing context has always brought with it a difficulty in being a witness for peace in a world that is gripped by violence. The Viking raids of the 9th and 10th centuries are no exception. In this paper, I will attempt to reveal how Alcuin of York, Charlemagne's finest theologian and clergyman, grapples with this question of violence by looking specifically at the Viking raids of 2 English monasteries in the last decade of the 8th century. I will show that Alcuin employs an Old Testament covenant model for explaining the 2 attacks, regarding those within Christendom, including the English, as the elect people of God, and those outside of it, the Viking raiders, as agents of God's wrath. Alcuin situates the elect of Christendom within a strict 2-kingdom framework and thus makes 2 varying ethical demands on the recipients of his letters. In these theological convictions, Alcuin is very much in line with traditional theological orthodoxy in the early Middle Ages. I will demonstrate these by first examining how Alcuin explained his attacks within his theological and ecclesiastical convictions. Following this, we will consider what Alcuin encourages recipients to practice in order to stave off further invasion. And finally, I will attempt to postulate why Alcuin responded in the particular theological fashion that he did. So this is the first section, Theology of the Covenant, Alcuin's response, looking at how, in some sense, Alcuin theologically evaluated the attacks of these Viking raiders. The crucial underpinning to all of Alcuin's theological claims concerning these two monastic raids, or the impending raids that would soon come on Wearmouth and Jarrow, must be viewed within his understanding of a covenantal relationship between God and Christendom. For Alcuin, Christendom is Charlemagne's geopolitical kingdom, as well as the Christian communities in Britain. So just a quick note on this, I argue in my paper that Alcuin believes Christendom to be a reality basically on two levels. One, it necessarily, for sure, includes Charlemagne's geopolitical kingdom on continental Europe, but in some sense, because of the impending raids of pagan Vikings, anybody who's vaguely Christian on the British Isles would also be within this kind of spiritual understanding of Christendom. So in this sense, even though they're not within Charlemagne's geopolitical kingdom, I think Alcuin in his letters kind of assumes that they do, in some sense, embody this Christian nation. So this is kind of the mindset of Alcuin. Alcuin, is the prophet of God, and the Viking raiders serve as agents of God's wrath for unfaithful activity. Though this conviction takes various forms in his letter, the accepted model is one in which a distinction is made between the people of God on the one hand and the pagan forces on the other, through whom God is using to chastise his people for their unfaithfulness to the covenantal precepts laid down in the New Testament. For Alcuin, nothing is random. Everything is the result of God's exhaustive, providential direction of all human events. So explicit in Alcuin's letters are his covenantal claims specific to those who are within Christendom, which by virtue of their Christian witness among the pagan attackers include the English people. Writing to Ethelred of Northumbria, Alcuin sees the English land as a symbol for God's covenant blessing. Quote, "O men, my brothers and fathers, also esteemed in Christ the Lord, desiring the divine mercy to conserve for us in the long-lasting prosperity our land, which at once with its grace conferred on us with free generosity." End quote. In the letter to Cudred, Alcuin writes, "Let them turn to God unreservedly, and if anything in their conduct needs amending, let them put it right wholeheartedly, that their conversion may please God." Quote. And in his letter to the monasteries of Wearmouth and Jarrow, Alcuin pleads, quote, "So mend your ways, lest the righteous perish for the sins of the wicked, lest the vineyard of the Lord be given up to be devoured by foxes, lest the feet of pagan tread upon the sanctuary of God." One can note how Alcuin implicitly forges a connection between the providential action of God in relationship to biblical Israel and his relationship to the English monasteries. This English-Israel connection is further developed in Alcuin's belief that specific covenant prophecies are actually being fulfilled in the English monasteries. In his letter to the monks of Wearmouth and Jarrow, he claims, quote, "You live near a sea from which the danger first came. In us is fulfilled what the prophet foretold. From the north evil breaks forth, and a terrible glory will come from the Lord." And here, Alcuin is looking at Jeremiah 1:14-15, in which the text says, "The Lord said to me, from the north disaster will be poured out on all who live in the land." But given these claims, one historian's conclusions are justified. Quote, "At the heart of Carolingian theology was a divinely determined universe where God's sovereignty was paramount and where he had chosen the Franks as elect people with all of the privileges and responsibilities that entailed." Quote. Alcuin makes it explicitly clear that despite the fact that the raids came from non-Christian heathens and that killing them in battle was justified on almost every possible ground, they were nevertheless still used by God as a means for his just retribution on the sinful behavior of God's elect. In his letter to Higbold, Alcuin attempts to answer why the attacks came on the community by writing, quote, "Truly it has not happened by chance, but it is a sign that it was well merited by someone." Quote. Later in the letter he goes on to further cite Hebrews 12:6 to offer condolences to those who are still in fear. He says, quote, "Yet be not dismayed in mind by this calamity. God chastiseth every son whom he receiveth, and thus perhaps chastise you more harshly because he loves you more." End quote. While Alcuin emphasizes the sinfulness of the elect and God's just punishment, he still will not disregard the notion that God will fight for the English and save them from their pagan enemies. In sorting through this seemingly troublesome paradox, Alcuin will draw on two historical examples, Rome and Jerusalem. He writes, quote, "Jerusalem, the city loved by God, perished with the temple of God in the flames of the Chaldeans. Rome, encircled by a crown of holy apostles and innumerable martyrs, was shattered by the ravages of pagans, but by the pity of God soon recovered. Almost the whole of Europe was laid desolate by the fire and sword of the Goths and Huns, but now, by God's mercy, it shines adorned with churches, at the sky with stars, and in them the offices of the Christian religion flourish and increase." Quote. So Alcuin thus draws a parallel between the biblical account in Jeremiah 52 when Jerusalem is sacked by the Chaldeans. As mentioned before, for Alcuin there is no difference between God's relationship to ancient Israel and God's relationship to Christendom in the Carolingian kingdom. As evident in this quotation, both experience the same divine providence that uses pagan enemies for chastisement and also delivers them from harm if their faithfulness is rekindled. Indeed, the overarching purpose of these letters runs parallel to the role of the Old Testament prophets. They too issued warnings that the wrath of God will soon be manifest and prodded their audience toward deeper covenant faithfulness. While Alcuin also models the Apostle Paul in his use of a formal letter opener, it is clear that the purpose behind these letters is thoroughly prophetic, with an underlying hope that the monastic communities will turn to their prior state of covenant faithfulness. Following this line of reasoning, Alcuin's exegetical approach to Scripture, emphasizing the literal and immediate application to Christendom, presupposes that its inhabitants were God's new chosen people and the true descendants of Old Testament Israel. So we see that Alcuin, writing to a people that he believes are descendants of God's covenant and due to their disobedience to the law of God, have duly merited the wrath of God through the raids of the Vikings. But in true prophetic fashion, Alcuin does not reference the left hand of God without also calling attention to the right. Thus, to answer the question of what the recipients of his letters are to do in order to turn from their sin, we must look at Alcuin's exhortations toward a more righteous behavior. He firmly believes, as Jeremiah did, that if the faithful are obedient, God will demonstrate his mercy. Well, that's the first section, looking at how he theologically evaluates them. The second section, called Ethics of the Elect, What is to be Done, this is where Alcuin actually gives examples, concrete examples of what people can do within these communities to stave off invasion, because we see that Alcuin's belief that the morality or the ethics of people within these communities is intimately tied to the providential action of God. So this is Ethics of the Elect, What is to be Done. Alcuin's theological explanations for the Lindisfarne raid, as well as the impending attacks on Wearmouth and Jarrow, are predicated upon a distinctive two-kingdom model that differentiates between the milites Christi and the milites seculares within the English ecclesiastical and political structure. So these are two Latin terms, and the former basically means soldiers for Christ, or people who are involved in the life of the church. So monks, priests, bishops, anyone who's involved in that sense. The latter is the milites seculares, or basically people who are involved with the state, so knights, kings, nobles, people of that nature. Alcuin's two-kingdom distinction is made with the overall purpose of providing one unified Christian kingdom. Thus, in attempting to involve people of both church and state function, the distinction fundamentally necessitates that he provided two different ethical demands to those two groups of Christians. Writing to Ethelred, Alcuin espouses this duality. Quote, Nothing defends a country better than the equity and godliness of princes and the intercessions of the servants of God. Quote. Soon after this, Alcuin further expounds on this distinction. Quote, Obey the priests of God, for they have an account to make to God, how they admonish you, and you, how you obey them. Let one peace and love be between you. They are interceders for you. You are defenders for them. Quote. The two-kingdom model presupposed by Alcuin is utterly inseparable from his admonitions that are discussed next. For only through this model has Alcuin the ability to make such a distinction between these two, justifying the use of the soldier on the one hand, while at the same time reserving a strict spiritual piety for the churchman. Both of these citizens fulfill the ethics determined by Alcuin to be essential for defense against the raiders. The soldier exercises force and therefore fulfills the Old Testament motif of a God who fights, sanctioning violent activity for the advancement of his chosen nation, and the churchman fulfill the uncompromising pacifism laid out in the New Testament, the Beatitudes. In sum, it is this model, and only through this model, that makes it possible for Alcuin to issue ethical exhortations in such a dualistic fashion. So beginning with the advice of the milites Christi, Alcuin firmly excludes any activity that resembles fighting in military combat. Furthermore, they are to embrace strict pacifism. This conviction is found in one of his letters to Bishop Higbo, who he writes, quote, You have a stronger defense in the mending of your conduct and the intercession of the saints who rest among you than in the massing of arrows and in the gathering of arms. Quote. Citing Isaiah 37:36, a passage in which the angel of the Lord, through a single prayer of King Hezekiah, put to death 185,000 Assyrians, Alcuin reveals that the weapons of the milites Christi are not physical swords, shields, and arrows, but are rather the spiritual weapons of prayer and fasting. Writing to Cudred, Alcuin admonishes him to, quote, keep scrupulously to the solitary way of life and private fare and regular fasting, in order that, quote, the protection of God and the intercession of our father, St. Cuthbert, may be granted. And, quote, Alcuin also urges the recipients of his letters to keep the rule of the monastic tradition in which they live. For him, the churchmen are warriors. It is just that their battle line is in the heart and not in the field. All of these exhortations toward better behavior and increased discipline find their meaning via Alcuin's belief in the reality of a spiritual enemy present in the resistance against the monasteries, as well as the power of the founding saints who offer protection to faithful communities. Impelling Higbald and the Lindisfarne community towards strict adherence to the monastic rule, Alcuin writes, quote, "Let all goodness, all practice of piety, all beauty of religion, joy of peace, and faithfulness to the monastic rule be seen in you, that the divine protection may save you from the enemies, visible and invisible." End quote. Writing to those at Wearmouth and Jarrow, Alcuin suggests that a spiritual element is assisting the raiders in their pillaging of Lindisfarne. Quote, "The outward enemy has power because of the enemy within." End quote. In light of this spiritual battle, clergy and monks were to call upon the saints of their monasteries for protection and deliverance. Alcuin stresses the importance of abstaining from vain luxuries in a letter to Higbald, hoping that, quote, "The most holy fathers who begot you may not cease to be your protectors. Treading in their footsteps, you may remain secure in their prayers." End quote. Again, writing to Cudred, he challenges the priest to urge his congregation to, quote, "trust in the protection of God and the intercession of our Holy Father, St. Cuthbert," quote. To be sure, the belief that saints protected monasteries and churches from external threats was a common theme since the early Middle Ages. But with these invasions from the pagan Vikings, the idea gained special prominence as a motivation for discipline and moral support. The evidence for Alcuin's exhortations regarding the milites seculares is minimal in comparison to that of the milites Christi. Concluding his letter to Higbald, Alcuin encourages military combat for knights. Quote, "When our Lord King Charles returns home, having by the mercy of God subdued his enemies, we plan, God helping us, to go with them." End quote. So Alcuin assumes the military function of Charlemagne and his forces in subduing the raiders, while also contending God's providential guidance over their victory. This is not to say, however, that Alcuin cared nothing for the piety of the milites seculares. He focused more on the religiosity of these statesmen than detailed military obligations. Rather than challenging the thesis of the study that two ethical distinctions were made between these two groups of Christians, this evidence highlights that Alcuin wanted a Christian military force to subdue the raiders, not simply a secular one. After all, the God of the Christian is the only one who can grant providential deliverance to the faithful. It seems that Carolingian clergy did not see any contradiction in God using the Vikings as a means of punishment, while they still encouraged practical defense measures to protect endowed monastic lands. In fact, there is evidence that peace treaties made with Viking raiders were often looked down upon as disloyal to God and his people. The logic seems to be that God only protects the Christian soldier when they faithfully carry out their own duties. Peace treaties and submission to foreign enemies seem to exist only within the pacifist realm of the milites Christi, and therefore should be avoided by the milites seculares at all costs. So in light of this evidence, we can now turn to consider the why question. Can we understand why Alcuin responded in the particular theological fashion that he did? So this is kind of the last section, I guess, summing up kind of Alcuin's theological legacy, looking a little bit of his method, and that'll be the end of the presentation. So this is Alcuin's theological legacy. In attempting to answer this question, it is important to discover Alcuin within the theological context of his time. We cannot understand Alcuin and his theological beliefs about war and violence without first recognizing a much broader medieval worldview that gave birth to those ideas. Moreover, we grasp Alcuin's theology only insofar as we understand theological orthodoxy during the Middle Ages. For as we shall see, Alcuin's theological voice is one of repetition, not innovation. Throughout his career as a theologian, Alcuin's theological approach reveled in the traditions of the Church, predicated on the defense of Catholic orthodoxy and the mirroring of conclusions reached by the great Latin fathers Ambrose, Augustine, and Jerome. A prominent Alcuin scholar put it this way, quote, "Respect for the authority was a predominant feature in his moral and intellectual composition, and its influence was perhaps most of all to be seen in his theological work." Quote, "At the heart of Alcuin's theological method is a theology that distrusts innovation, seeks after the traditions of the past, and strives to echo the conclusions of preceding Christian writers in a new context." Alcuin was not only a transmater of the great traditions of the Church, but more specifically, he was a theologian existing within Augustine's shadow. The theological premise laid out in his letters concerning the Viking raiders seems to be Alcuin's interpretation of Augustine's City of God in the new context of the Carolingian Empire and Christendom. The contrast that Augustine made between the eternal city of God, a community formed on the basis of a love toward God, and the temporal city of man, a community on the basis of love toward self, seems to take form in Alcuin's strong convictions regarding the Christendom's elect status and the utter rejection of anything pagan. In essence, the ethic of Augustine's city of God is recapitulated, however unfaithfully, by Alcuin in his dealing with the elect of God and the pagan Vikings. In addition to Alcuin's understanding of Augustine's philosophy of history, present within his theological reflection, he conforms quite well to the Carolingian church-state relationship that was engineered by Charlemagne. Christendom to Alcuin, including the proper sanction of military protection afforded by Charlemagne, was the inheritor of God's covenant. Therefore, Charlemagne was not only the head of the Frankish kingdom, but also the righteous defender of the Catholic Church in Rome. And to this end, Alcuin's theological response to the raid of Lindisfarne and the impending raids facing Wearmouth and Jarl must necessarily be supportive of this relationship between Charles and the Church. So in conclusion, the Viking raid of Lindisfarne and the exhortations given to those at Wearmouth and Jarl ultimately bring to surface Alcuin's theological convictions regarding war and violence. Very much indebted to the theological culture of his time, Alcuin's ideas concerning warfare are informed by his belief in a covenantal relationship between Christendom and God. Through this model, Alcuin has the basis to theologically evaluate the Vikings' assault, and through this model, he gives dualistic advice to clergy and statesmen that cohere with the Carolingian church-state relationship. For Alcuin, this underlying narrative shades contemporary events in biblical colors and justifies the royal kinship authority through which Charlemagne defends the elect of God against the pagan attackers. And I guess that's it. So I guess I cut down a little bit and I tried to find something that would be appropriate for the time slot available. So if there's any questions, I would, I guess venture to answer those now. Yes?
So he's writing to the head of Lindisfarne and saying basically that the raids are because of unfaithfulness among the monks there or among the Christians in England. Does he ever talk about the book of Job and some of the complexities of the friends accusing Job of sin when there was none? Mm-hmm. And did the Lindisfarne people write back and say, no, we didn't become unfaithful?
Mm-hmm. As far as I know, I looked at 7 specific letters. I didn't look at every one of his letters. He wrote over 2,000 letters. So the ones that I looked at, no, he did not cite any specific references to Job. And there was no return letters by, churchmen within those monastic communities. And that might have to do with the actual event of the invasions. People were scattering, trying to, not be slaughtered by Vikings. So, no, there wasn't any response.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, in terms of the research you did, what kinds of sources were particularly helpful to you?
Mm-hmm. Well, firstly, I guess to set kind of the historical context, I looked at the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. That kind of provided the basis for, what I argued for the attacks of 793 on Lindisfarne, and then in 794 on the twin monasteries of Wearmouth and Jarl. And then I looked at, two main books that included English translations of Alcuin's Latin letters. And those, were very helpful because they're English. I didn't actually translate from the Latin. But those are the letters, and then the historical context was gained from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So. Yeah.
Taylor, I was wondering, did you read any secondary sources that talked about, because I'm always thinking of the context here, so where he ends up is actually doesn't seem surprising based on the context you've already described. I mean, this is a transition from so-called Dark Ages to the Holy Roman Empire or whatever, and the assumption of Germanic law. I mean, the idea is God is with the winners. If you won, then God's on their side. And so if anything's happening at all negative to Christians, the assumption, there's a particular assumption of what the covenant is. They're violators of the covenant. God is punishing them. That could be the only answer, which kind of gets to the question that Eric was mentioning. No Job, no other possibility other than that they're God's covenant people. They're messing up the covenant somehow. God is judging them.
Yeah, as far as my research, that was the only thing that was merited. But I do know that I think that Alcuin did see, like you said, the activity within these monastic communities is tied to God's providential control. So that's why I argue for a covenant, is that because of God's sovereignty, we have an idea that the ethics of these people within these communities will, depending on the morality or the immorality of that, will I guess, merit God's either judgment or blessing. But yeah, there wasn't anything about Job. There wasn't any other biblical references. And it was hard, too, because it's a paper that I wrote in 2 months, and I was somewhat limited, not because of, I guess, Latin translations. And also, I didn't really want to compose a broad theological understanding of Alcuin. I was just trying to look at 7 occasional letters that focus on a specific rate. So in that sense, I guess it's limited. But yeah, Professor Carolingian.
What did you find anything in terms of imperial policy towards Northumbria or the British Isles that would help to explain why Alcuin? I mean, is it because these people are spiritually part of Christendom, but they have not yet become politically part of Christendom? I mean, like faithfulness, what does that look like? I mean, that can look like very many different things.
Sure.
I mean, is there a connection with the Irish Church or?
Okay. Well, as far as I understand it, with Gregory the Great and with mission work toward the Anglo-Saxons, you have a strong emphasis on the Latin rite within those monastic communities. And Alcuin is actually from York, so he's actually writing back to his home. I think he establishes a very intimate connection with those communities. But politically speaking, there wasn't necessarily a connection between Charlemagne and these monastic communities. So that's why I have to argue in my paper that geopolitically speaking, there isn't a connection within that empire. But I try to argue at least faithfulness means, depending on who you are, remaining faithful to the rule of monasticism, which would be the Latin rite, and the Benedictine understanding of what that looks like. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I guess it's not politically speaking within the empire, but I have to argue that in some sense spiritually they are connected to Charlemagne's, I guess, Catholic Church in that sense. So. Yeah.
You began by saying that this grew out of an interest of yours, the curiosity about just wars and peace. How has this colored your perception and understanding of today's world, whether or not the wars that we're involved in as a country are just or unjust? And I don't know if you've thought beyond your historical paper, if this has had any meaning to you, how you translate that today.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I think that first off, it helps to have some type of historical knowledge on how someone dealt with this during the early Middle Ages. But I think, for me personally, the conviction coming out of this, something that has been developed over the last couple of years, is that the kingdom of God is something that's transnational, that crosses national borders, it crosses racial and ethnic lines. It's something that's global in that sense. So because of that conviction, I feel like I would do well as a Christian not to so forcefully depict certain groups of people as pagan and certain groups of people as Christian. I would be much better to realize the plank in my own eye before casting it in someone else's. So as far as peace and war go, I mean, it's a difficult question. It's questions that I've struggled with. I think a lot of the history professors have challenged me to think critically about those things. But just because I don't necessarily agree with Alcuin's theology, I think it's also a good thing for me to understand why he responded the way he did in the theological context of his time. So.
I'm sorry, I have another question. What do you think Alcuin means when he says, I mean, the covenant, obviously, people have been using it forever, meaning of Abraham, that in you all people or all nations will be blessed. What do you think he means by that? What does it mean to be God's covenant? What do you get?
Well, I guess for Alcuin, I would say it's just a great way to contrast with pagan attackers. Being part of a covenant, being part of an Old Testament story that is much larger than just the particular historical context. So I think in that sense, he's trying to draw upon I guess, macro narrative of God's action in the world. And because he believes, I argue that Christendom is in some sense blessed by God's covenantal protection. It's a great way to justify military force toward these pagan Vikings, but also in some sense distinguish themselves from them because I guess the Christian, like I wrote in the paper, is really the only person who can merit such a blessing. So I think the covenant is kind of the paradigm through which he tries to, I guess, situate the English monastic communities within. So, is there any other questions or?
Thank you.